Welcome once again to Living in the 21st Century. Joining me this morning is Vadim Kravets. Vadim, it's a pleasure to have you on Living in the 21st Century.
Thank you, Errol.
Sure. Today, I'm really glad that you can come on because you can shed some insight as to your opinion when it comes to the invasion of Russia to Ukraine. What is so essential and important that you think Russia should retain their land from Ukraine, whatever the case may be. But before I answer that question, I also want to say, as of on the 4th of September, you had more than 623,000 Russian troops who would have given their life in this war, and billions of dollars in military equipment would have been destroyed. And I want to see whether this is really worth it, because on the other side, there are thousands and tens of thousands of Ukrainians who would have lost their lives also. And if it's so worth trying to bring back some cohesiveness of the USSR, take it away and shed some light on that.
Well, I'm going to probably begin with cautioning you against the numbers.
Okay.
Because the way the information trickles in and presented is not necessarily correct. Usually you have to account for the biases in calculations and so on and so forth. So I just don't want to focus too much on the number of people who are dying in this conflict. I think it's quite a large number on both sides. And the proportions are probably irrelevant since we are speaking of human lives.
Right.
Just the fact that they're being lost warrants and legitimizes your question as to worthiness of the conflict. And it's a complicated question. I would probably start with whether it was inevitable or not, because I think the inevitability sort of dictates here. It's not so much dictates, but inevitability of it sort of leads us to whether it's worthwhile for either of the sides, And I think that if we start there, I believe that the situation just escalated to a point where it was inevitable for the sides to probably collide. From the Ukrainian standpoint, I think that Ukraine wanted to regain its territory, which was separationist Donbass, as they perceived it. I perceived it as a separationists who needed to be brought back into the realm of what the Ukrainians perceived as the Ukraine. Whereas on the Russian side, they felt that the people of Donbass, who were mostly Russian ethnically, deserved protection from the Russian side. And multiple attempts have been made in order to peacefully resolve the situation, but for some reason that resolution never came. Of course, I could go into the details, but in order to unpack this whole conflict will require quite a bit of time on our side in order to do so. But both sides saw that their interests haven't been met. In the case of Ukraine, it's the integrity of its territory. On the side of the Russian, it's the protection of their people, and potentially a threat that was emanating from the Ukrainian territory toward the Russian side. So I think that since the resolution didn't come, both sides decided that war was the only method of resolving it. And I guess many decided to lay their lives to bring that their point of view to the effect, so to speak.
Okay.
That's my answer. So
okay. Well, let me answer this question. The Russian government believe that their obligation is to make sure that Donbass region remain the territories of Russia, and there are more Russian-oriented people living in Donbass than Ukrainians. Now, does those folks who live in Donbass have that same view or opinion that they should be called Russians opposed to Ukrainians, or they should see themselves as pro-Russians opposed to Ukrainians? And if so, it is well worth it to make that declaration through the formation of war?
The people of Donbass, but first of all, if you take a historical perspective, Donbass was part of Novorossiya, which is what is returning its name now, which means New Russia, established by Catherine the Great and Tsars and other people, including Odessa, Crimean Peninsula, all that part of what is known Ukrainian USSR, while it wasn't a part of Soviet Union, was given to Ukraine in 1918 so it was Lenin's gift to Ukraine in a sense, but it was all during the existence of Russian Empire. It was part of the Russian territory. So people who settled that part of Ukraine are largely ethnically Russian, although that's a very tenuous kind of distinction. That's a separate subject, and I don't want to expand into that area. What I'm going to say that yes, largely population of Donbass identifies itself with larger Russian culture than the Ukrainian culture, which stems largely from the western part of Ukraine. Ukraine is a very heterogeneous nation, but for some reason it chose a path of homogeneity, which is impossible. And federalization of Ukraine was proposed by Russia in order to retain its territory. After people of Donbass declared their independence and they fought the Ukrainian ideology, so to speak, Ukrainian rule, the attempts were made by the Russian side, multiple attempts, with the Minsk agreement, those chords that have been struck between Ukraine and Russia, and with the signatures of Germany and France, they presupposed re-entry of Donbass region into Ukraine. So prior to the conflict erupting, all of that has been addressed. Mm-hmm. And Putin's proposal was to reintegrate. He wanted Donbass to go back to Ukraine. He said, please reintegrate it, but do it so under the federalization. So he was trying to make Ukraine, like, give it the status of federalized autonomous district of Ukraine. So he wanted Donbass to go back there, but Ukraine.
Sorry for interrupting you, but I want to interrupt for 1 second.
Sure,
because I saw a historic transition in where the land of Crimea and Donbass were gifted over to the Ukrainians. Yes, those who were living and settled on those pieces of land felt more, their allegiance were more to Russia than Ukraine. But nevertheless, the land were gifted over. There was a new philosophical view on how this land would have been seen by the Ukrainians now. This is Putin's idea that he wants to reintegrate these regions together. And this is now, we all can have philosophical views on being a part of other territory, but considering the fact that, you can still feel Russian if you want to, but considering the fact that we're no longer Russian, and I'll give you a classic example. Where it came from is Barbados. It was a British colony owned by Great Britain, and we gained independence, and we had severed ties from Great Britain. Even though there may be those who felt that their allegiance are to Great Britain, the government of Great Britain never said, well, you know what? Let's reclaim Barbados. Let's go after and shape it back into what we call a colony. No, it never happened. I think, and this is my opinion, I think it would have been probably better off to have some formation of awareness that those who were in the Ukrainian territories still celebrate the fact that they got Russian ties, and whether they have a holiday or some day to commemorate that, know where they came from. I think that would have been a great idea. But the whole notion to reinvent the wheel and have a war, I don't see the logic in why so many people have to die from both sides just over an illogical view. The people that thought of it never got up and rebelled and said, well, you know what, we want to, or protest and say we want to be Russians, even though they were living in Crimea and Donbass. They never did that. But one man idea propagated among these people, then inspired them to say, you know what, let's go to war. And maybe they didn't even want that themselves, because they end up, hundreds and probably thousands of them also end up getting killed despite of this war. What's your opinion on that?
I feel, I don't think Russia, after the willful dissolution of Soviet Union, it was a sort of a willful event which combined sort of an agreement between Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia had never had any claims on the territory of the newly formed Ukraine. It never bothered. It has its own territories, vast territories that it has still to develop. So there's so much to do. So there was no need for Russia to acquire new territories. It doesn't need them. But after the coup of 2014 in Ukraine, when the legitimately elected president Yanukovych was deposed, the balance of ideology of Ukraine has shifted. And normally, as always, when coups take place, it fractures the society internally. So it fractured Ukraine internally because the East, which is the Donbass region, had a big say in who the president was. It's a very densely populated region. And Yanukovych, being the president of Ukraine, was largely representative of that group of people. So when he was deposed in 2014 coup, that region rebelled and didn't want to associate with what Ukraine posed itself to be. And the modern Ukraine that evolved since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, is Ukraine largely based on the ideology of Galicia region, which is the Western Ukraine, which has nothing to do with the rest of the Ukraine. It's the region that has been under Austro-Hungarian Empire for 200 years. Their mentality, their attitudes, and everything they espouse completely separate from the rest of the Ukrainian population. But that ideology dominated, and what happened, that ideology prevailed during that 2014 coup, which created a reaction on the part of the Donbass people who didn't want anything to do with that. And so from there, since 2014, the coup of the Ukrainian coup and rebellion of Donbass until 2022, when the conflict happened, there were multiple attempts to other people who didn't want anything to escalate to the point of where it is now. But I want to bring myself back to my point of inevitability. But because of the resistance and inability, inflexibility of the Ukrainian government to see situation for what it was, it escalated to where it is now. The Ukrainians assembled large forces at the border of Donbass in 2022. And Russia never begins wars. It always ends them. It lost 27 million people during World War II. It knows what 27 million, the majority was the civilian population. It never wants any wars because of such great losses that it suffered against the Nazi regime. So it never wants wars. The last thing that it would want is a war. And if the war happens in that region, it's usually because of an inevitability and inflexibility of those who are not willing to find peaceful solutions. And I think Ukraine at that point it just didn't have a choice. It was probably locked by its mentality or influence from the West, and just did not allow for the Donbass to reintegrate into its territory, which was possible, and Minsk agreement was all about it. under the autonomous rights, where that it could vote, but they knew. You have to understand, if Ukraine, that Galician, that Western mentality, Ukraine allowed that region to come back into its realm as an autonomous region, it would not be able to sustain that ideology of the Western Ukraine. The field would even out again, and it just couldn't. It needed unified country. Everybody's Ukrainian, even though it's a huge mix of Russians, Ukrainian, everyone. Ukraine is a big hodgepodge of nationalities. It's not just Ukrainians, it's everyone. So because of its inflexibility, it created a situation where inevitability of conflict was finalized. That's my perspective.
Okay.
I hope I wasn't too convoluted in my explanation.
Tell me this. Now, the Western world obviously believe that it is more than just a philosophical, ideological view on territorial balance between Ukraine and Russia. They see it as also a threat of between dictatorship and democracy. The notion is that Putin's concept and ideas, politically speaking, doesn't necessarily align with democracy ideas or concepts. And when this war broke out, it was broke out on the foundation that we have to support Ukraine because of democracy, opposed to dictatorship. And that concept is spread throughout the European region and its allies. What is your opinion about that and this view?
Okay. I think my opinion is that everything is in definitions. What's defined as democracy, what is defined as dictatorship. I'll give you a few examples. Like, for example, Mr. Zelensky. Who is he right now? Is he a president of Ukraine or a dictator? Because no elections were held. His term has expired, right? And some might claim that under the circumstances of the war, his transition to presidency without election was legitimate. However, there are certain, within democratic institutions, there are certain policies to which one has to adhere. And if he weren't afraid, in my opinion, of the fact that he could be deposed by holding the election, he would have held those elections, and the support for him would be overwhelming. But these elections were never held, and he just is recognized by the West as a president of Ukraine without holding the election. That's just one example. Another example, many claim that Putin has spent so many years in the seat of president of Russia. In many Western countries, legitimacy of his power has been questioned. And, even though people do overwhelmingly support him, Russian people do. But again, from the Western perspective, it's somehow viewed as not legitimate, and maybe the elections have been tampered with, or however, whatever language they try to use. It's possible. We're not gonna argue that point right now. But the second example that I was leading toward was the example of Angela Merkel, the president or the chancellor of Germany. She spent in the seat of a chancellor 20 years. So she pretty much as long as Putin has been. But for some reason, Merkel is viewed as democratically elected, and Putin is viewed as somebody who is a tyrant who usurped the power. You see?
Well, in all fairness, though, there's reasons why Putin was branded as this terrorist. I mean, up to this juncture, even in the war, we would have seen a lot of, we know there's always casualty of wars, but we see where innocent civilians were killed, hospitals had been bombed, so much humanitarian crimes had been established in this war. But paramount above that, if you go back to the prehistoric time of Putin's life, as a member in the KGB, his character didn't speak too well of himself. He is noted up to this day for a person who knows to get rid of people in some very indecent ways, whether it's through the formation of poison or assassinations, whatever the case may be. there is a very dark, sinister side that the Western, not assuming, but know for a fact that he is capable of. That side is manifesting clearly even in this war, to the point where when things didn't working well for the Russian soldiers, they end up killing innocent civilians in the households and the hospitals and so forth. And that, in a sense, is pure dictatorial to some nature. I don't see anything that is realistic about it, but I would love to welcome your opinion on that also.
So the question is whether Putin's past somehow formed an individual and explains his behavior now. And the example of the behavior you're citing is the atrocities perpetrated by the Russian troops on the Ukrainian territory. Am I understanding the question correctly?
Well, yes, because a leopard in nature can't change its spots. It doesn't matter if you paint it. The reality, his behavioral pattern and how he get things done in his past years as a KBG member or operative or whatever the case may be, is the same system is being established now in the midst of this war. Yes, I spoke about casualties of wars that happen. Where there's wars, we get casualties. But when there are deliberate things of females getting raped, husbands getting killed, hospitals getting bombed, children getting killed, and babies, I mean, the nature of this war is not just a war. It's even worse than a Holocaust, if you ask me. Do you see any, despite of, as I said, the philosophical, ideological concepts of what the land of Crimea and Donbass region, who were gifted over to Ukraine in the 1980s, even though they still have a philosophical view of who they are as a people, I don't think that worth this fight. There are many ways of acknowledging who they are, whether it's through a holiday, a celebration, to commemorate where they came from and who they belong to. I mean, many countries do this every day, and they don't have to have a war for that. What's your concept about it? That's why he said that Putin, idea, represents who you are as a dictator. I know you were saying that Zelensky in transition to his presidency as an elected official, but I will have to ask a question. Did this happen during the course of the war or before the war?
During the course of the war, it was very recently, I think in March, he was supposed to hold the elections.
He couldn't.
He didn't. No.
He couldn't. I mean, in a war at this pinnacle, I don't see. There's no need to hold election. Millions of people have fled to neighboring countries as refugees. Your support is going. You have a war that you have to pin down and get things in order. There's no civilization at that juncture to really host an election. So I wouldn't really lean much on that part, but I'm looking from the standpoint at the things that was demonstrated in the eyes of modern society. Is the war really worth it? I mean, I don't see why I'm going to waste billions of dollars over equipment to destroy the next country and lose over six. I mean, I can't dispute the figures. I don't know the figures. I'm only telling you what's from the Kyiv Independent. I can't state it's factual, but I believe it may be factual. But at the same very time, do all of this bloodshed really call for just because of pieces of land that was gifted to a country because the residents don't think that the person who was elected to represent them got deposed of and wasn't able to represent them, that they get them and rebel and say, you know what, we're going back to Russia. So Russia say, you know what, we getting our people now. We can do whatever it takes to get our people. I don't know, I'm not sure if that was the appropriate way to go about doing that, but what's your opinion again?
Well, I'll start with you describing the conflict itself and maybe the spelling on how it's perceived by the West. You know, here in in the news, you see the atrocities which you describe. And again, you have to be very careful.
Yes.
It's a case by case, but I'm not going to get into it. I just going to caution people against trying.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You have to really research and understand what's going on.
Yes.
But if you look at the life in Kiev, you called it a war, right? In Russia, it's called special military operation.
Okay.
If you look at Kiev and the rest of Ukraine, people sit in the cafes, and students go to the schools. They enjoy their daily lives. It's not like, in a real war where bombings are so widespread and pervasive that, population is dying by scores. No. People are going about their lives. Life goes on. And in the conditions such as these, it's hard to call it a war. If you, for example, take an Iraq war, in which United States conducted, they bombed everything. That's how normally the war is conducted. You annihilate through bombing everything, cities, everything, and you put all the you bring to a halt everything, all the infrastructure, everything is destroyed, bridges, everything is demolished. Okay. None of that exists in Ukraine. Russia didn't destroy it. Very carefully is eliminating Ukrainian electric grid and infrastructure only to slow down their military, slow down and maybe affect their military capabilities. But overall, there are, of course, incidences. I don't argue that incidences of the strikes that eliminated some of the... But overall, Russia, this whole conflict does not touch... Yes, population flees, and some of it flees to Russia. Some of the Ukrainians fled to Russia when they were able to, some to the West. But life goes on. And in the conditions such as these, election could have been held. That was my main point. You see, election could have been held.
Okay. Vadim, I want to pause here. I want to do a follow-up interview, a second part of this, because I want to look at that part when several Ukrainians had fled to Russia, that it wasn't an easy transitioning into Russia either. The media
it was natural because they're Russian.
Okay,
there's no distinction.
But that would be a great discussion. But I want to do a part 2 of this interview. The next 2 Saturdays, so we can keep in touch, right? But we are down to the last 29 seconds, so I want to say thank you, Vadim. We'll see each other pretty soon again. And for all those who have been tuning in on Living in the 21st Century, have a great day.